News of the Times. Yarmouth's darkest day since the plague. The 1845 bridge disaster. Yarmouth, 1845. A special treat awaited adults and children alike. A clown in a washing tub drawn up the River Bure by four geese. The absurd star act of a travelling equestrian show. But what began as light-hearted entertainment would end in one of the most horrific civilian disasters in British history, as hundreds crowded the Yarmouth suspension bridge to catch a glimpse of the clown's progress. The structure suddenly collapsed beneath them. In seconds, hundreds of spectators, mostly women and children, were hurled into the River Bure. Many were crushed by falling iron, others drowned, trapped among twisted balustrades, or dragged under by the panicking hands of fellow victims. Victorian newspapers called it a scene of murder, with the death toll rivaling the Great Plague that had once ravaged the town. By nightfall, 97 people lay dead, most of them children, and Great Yarmouth was plunged into its darkest day in living memory. In the chaos that followed, one young survivor claimed he had struck women in the face with a knife to stop them pulling him under. Another described floating on corpses, the streets filled with bodies, the cries of bereaved parents, and the eerie silence of lives lost too swiftly to be identified. This was no mere engineering failure. This was a moment seared into the soul of the town. This is the story of the Yarmouth Bridge disaster, of hubris and heartbreak, of missed warnings and mass mourning. It is, as one newspaper wrote at the time, a judgment too dreadful to be forgotten. And in today's end of episode Further Particulars segment, a very different kind of further particulars. A selection of curious Victorian headlines from 1845, from peasants breaking into workhouses to exploding cotton bales to a young man tragically impaled by his own ramrod. It's a bizarre little news feed from the era, and frankly we found it more fascinating than half the things on our modern timeline. So settle in. I'm prepared to be transported to the streets of 1845 Yarmouth, a bustling Victorian town about to witness one of the most harrowing tragedies in its history. A day of laughter and spectacle would end in silence, sorrow, and scenes so haunting the newspapers could only describe them as a judgment. This is News of the Times, and this is the story of Yarmouth's darkest day since the plague. In 1845, Great Yarmouth was a curious blend of fishing port, market town, and rising seaside resort. It had long been known for its herring industry, which drew seasonal workers from all over the region. But more recently, the arrival of the railway in 1844 had begun to change its character. Day trippers and holidaymakers were now arriving from Norwich and beyond, seeking sea air, entertainments and novelty performances along the quay. The town had its fashionable crescents, its inns and assemblies, but also its slums and overcrowded alleyways. Wealth and poverty sat side by side, often separated only by a few yards. On market days, the streets teemed with noise, produce, and locals from the surrounding Norfolk villages. It was a place on the cusp of change, where the old fishing culture met the new appetite for Victorian spectacle. In Dickens's novel, Yarmouth is portrayed as a vivid, windswept coastal town full of character and hardship. It's home to the Peggotty family, who famously lived in an upturned boat on the beach, a detail that was based on real Yarmouth fishing families of the time. Dickens knew the town well and visited frequently. He described it as the most wondrous sight his eyes had ever beheld. It served him both as a setting and a symbol, a town of shifting sands and moral tempests. The suspension bridge at Great Yarmouth was opened in April 1829, designed by the London architect Joseph John Scholes and built by Gidney Goddard. It offered a fine new crossing of the River Bure at North Quay, replacing an older ferry route and linking a seaside town still growing in reputation. The Yarmouth Suspension Bridge. To understand how this disaster unfolded, we must first understand the bridge and the town it served. The suspension bridge at the centre of the tragedy had once been a modest crossing, but everything changed with the arrival of the railway. As one reporter noted, it has since become the principal, if not the only, medium of transit to and from the railway terminus. The bridge had already been the subject of legal dispute between its owner, Mr. Corey, and the railway company, but once settled, its use exploded. Thousands now crossed it weekly. And so, to accommodate the crowds, the owners extended the bridge, widening the pedestrian paths by 4 feet on each side, using chains to carry the load. On paper, it was simply, in practice, deadly. From on the day of the disaster, the weight was uneven. The south side closest to the clown's approach became densely packed, while the north side was almost empty. One witness later recalled the bridge was so overloaded. The crown of the bridge was completely flattened. He mentioned it to a companion, but their attention, like everyone else's, was fixed on the approaching spectacle. Moments later, the structure began to fail. A tremor, a lowering of the south side. Then the chains began to snap, one after another, in terrible succession. A newspaper described how the bridge hung half submerged, still held aloft on one side by the chains that had not yet broken. A grotesque metal jaw, its victims sliding into the river below. From the Globe, the 5th of May, 1845. Awful catastrophe. The fall of Yarmouth Suspension Bridge. Upwards of 100 lives lost. It is with an almost overwhelming feeling of awe that we attempt to draw upon our faculties for description of a scene of horror it has never yet been the lot of any journalist in this country, England, to record. In vain, we do endeavour to select words which may in the most fitting manner portray the agony of mind which, alas, affects half the miserable population of Yarmouth. In vain do we seek for epitaphs to paint the dismal scenes which families who but a few short hours since were happy fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, children and friends at this moment present throughout this ill-fated town. Language possesses not half the power requisite to tell the horrifying spectacle, the awful summoning of hundreds of human beings in a moment before the judgment seat of their Maker. Old and young, the grave and gay, the virtuous and the vicious, husband, wife, father and child, all were swept from this world. The thread of life snapped asunder in one instant, at the moment when aught else but danger and death were in their contemplation. Such is the delicate, uncertain tenure upon which human life depends. Such is the almighty power and will of the Creator. On the afternoon of the day on which this narration bears date, Nelson the Clown at Mr. Cook's circus had undertaken to swim in a tub drawn by 4 geese from the drawbridge on the quay to the suspension bridge across the North Riser. A foolish exhibition, but it was one which, from its novelty in Yarmouth, was calculated to attract the multitude. As early as 5 o'clock, when the train arrives from Norwich, although raining smartly, thousands of spectators had already assembled on both sides of the river to witness the feat. The bridge then was comparatively clear. The clown commenced his feat with the flood tide at the drawbridge and had entered the North River. There were many persons on the bridge, and as he drew near the multitude, they rushed upon it to obtain full view as he should pass underneath. Already had he reached the Bessie Wharf, not far from the bridge, when 1 or 2 of the rods were observed to give way. An instant alarm was given to quit the bridge. Alas, the caution came too late. The chain broke, and quick as the passing thought, one entire side fell, and the whole mass of human beings, whose numbers are estimated at from 300 to 600, were swept into the river below. The bridge, which but an instant before was horizontal, had now become perpendicular. The children, poor things, of whom we hear there were many, had naturally gathered to the balustrade, where, of course, the first to sink, while the force with which one side fell caused those who were upon the other side to be hurled with terrific force into the water beneath, crushing and destroying those under them. Oh, who shall paint the one mighty, simultaneous, agonizing death scream which burst upon the affrighted multitude around, re-echoing from earth to heaven the appeal not made in vain? One instant and all was hushed, save the straggling of few whose lives it pleases their Maker in his mercy to spare. The waters, we are told, as it is gifted with a sudden impulse of horror at this fell swoop of death, recoiled in the impetus of the fall, and boiled up at the back of the bridge, which hung perpendicularly down to the river's edge. As suddenly the struggle for life was past for all but a few. Then came a scene scarcely less heart-rending, with energy, activity, and stern determination of purpose, which are amongst the wise and the merciful provisions of the Almighty. 27 children, all girls, were immediately rescued alive on the west side of the river, and as instantly put to bed at the Vauxhall Gardens, who, as soon as revived, were replaced by others equally beneficently spared, or by some never to be recalled. On the east side, numbers of bodies were taken into the adjoining houses, where all the assistance which medical skill, humane attention, in short, all the aid which humanity would teach everyone to offer, was brought to bear. Alas, now often in vain. In one house alone at 9 o'clock, out of 68 bodies carried in, only 3 were revived. When the express train left, at that time they were still continuing to drag the river, and had put nets across to prevent the bodies from being carried away with the tide. Bodies, it is believed, are entangled with the rods and other portions of the broken bridge. The escape of some was miraculous. One woman of the name of Giddings, the wife of a carpenter who was on the bridge with her child when she was hurled into the water, with extraordinary presence of mind, she seized her child's clothes with her teeth, thus preventing the rush of water and paddling herself to a place of safety. The scene now presented is most agonizing. Children, mothers and fathers seeking one or others of their families, tracing and discovering in the pale face of some of the dead one of their dearest ties. In every street are to be seen one or more bodies extending on biers, returning to those homes from which but some short minutes before they had passed health and life. The consternation, the agony of the town is not to be described. It is as if some dread punishment was felt to fall upon its inhabitants. Every face is horror-stricken. Never since the devastating plague in 1759, which swept off 2,000 of its inhabitants, has Yarmouth, notwithstanding its numberless shipwrecks, been visited with so dire a calamity. The distressing intelligence was instantly transmitted to Norwich by the electric telegraph, and a special train was immediately set off containing the manager at the station and other persons. The tidings soon spread, and the station was not only soon filled, but a large number of persons awaited outside as the result of the communications. The first intelligence was telegraphed at 50 minutes after 5, and instantly express messages were sent into the city and to journalists communicating the intelligence. When we left the station at 10 o'clock, numbers were still there making inquiries and receiving replies. V7. Further account. Many a touching scene was witnessed as the anxious mother and the hardly less excited father or friend recognized some missing one safely emerging from the crowd. Thousands thronged the North Quay. Messages were dispatched in all directions to procure medical aid, and the communication with the west side of the water being cut off, hundreds were left in painful suspense respecting those who were safe on the opposite shore. Nothing could exceed the promptitude, activity and attention of the surgeons and medical men of the town, all of whom were in immediate attendance, doing all they could to afford the sufferers, where the slightest chance of resuscitation appeared. Mr. Lacon and a number of the persons employed in his brewery were exceedingly active in supplying hot water for baths from their brewery, which is not far distant. All the blankets from the Union House that could possibly be spared were requisitioned. The search for the bodies was continued till after 9:30 o'clock, when the boats were compelled to desist. But before the turn of the tide, nets were placed on each side of the bridge to prevent, if possible, any of the bodies not yet recovered being carried out to sea by the force of the current, which is very strong. The consternation which pervades the whole mass of our population, the intense grief into which almost everyone we meet is plunged, seem to defy our attempts to procure authentic information. The difficulty is materially enhanced from the inability which has prevailed to identify many of the bodies. Saturday morning. The scene at the broken bridge at this moment is one of the most heart-harrowing it has ever been our lot to witness. Before the faintest approach of morning, a number of boatmen and others have been most actively engaged endeavouring to find the bodies of the missing persons, and their efforts have been to some degree successful, as 3 more bodies have been discovered. The banks on either side of the stream, even at this hour, are crowded with an expectant and anxious throng, who wait in breathless anxiety the efforts of the boatmen, anticipating in every fresh endeavour to recognise the features of some beloved object. On one side may be seen a group of pale and weeping women with tearful eyes watching the progress of the search, and on the other a group of hardy seamen, their strong frames convulsed with emotion as they clasped their arms around the dripping corpse of some favourite child and carried, just as it had been lifted from the water, their home. Indeed, a more distressing scene than the present, or catastrophe more horrible in its consequence, has never been our lot to witness. Every side, wherever the beholder turns, the same frightful prospect of suffering is apparent. It is generally supposed that many persons who were standing on the edge of the bridge or on that portion allotted to foot passengers when the accident occurred clasped the handrails and were precipitated head foremost into the stream and became entangled amongst the broken balustrades. The body of a little girl, the daughter of a man named George Parker, coal heaver, has just been brought out. The bodies are so swelled and distorted that in many cases identification has been extremely difficult. One of the nets has just been drawn, but this contained no bodies. One or two circumstances demand passing glance. One, the state of the bridge. That structure was erected by the late Robert Corey, Esquire, in lieu of the ancient ferry across the Bure, of which he was possessed, and was opened on the 23rd of April 1829 and suspended from chains on either side, attached to 4 pedestals or piers, also of iron, and fastened to abutment stones. In April 1844, in contemplation of increased traffic to the railway, and in order to afford sufficient width for carriages to pass, a platform for foot passengers was erected outside the bars on either side, it being the intention of the proprietors, on completing the arrangement with the railway company and obtaining an Act of Parliament which had been applied for this session, to erect a new arched stone bridge. The immense weight of the thickly corrugated mass being thrown on one side of the bridge caused the calamity. Many questions have been asked as to how far it was the duty of the police to have prevented such numbers assembling on the bridge. To this we cannot venture a reply. It is not attempted to be denied that a large body of the police were in attendance on both sides of the river, where danger seemed most to be anticipated, to prevent, if possible, any accident. Their error, if such it should be called, seems to have been one of judgment, not of neglect of duty, and had the accident not happened, probably no observation would have been made. The above account from the Globe, published just days after the disaster, captured the stunned grief and biblical scale of the tragedy, calling it a judgment too dreadful to be forgotten. But the national papers would not stop there. In the days that followed, more detailed and chilling accounts would pour in. The Westmoreland Gazette, writing nearly a week later, reconstructed the scene from witness testimony and rescue efforts, adding layer upon layer of heartbreak. From the Westmoreland Gazette, the 10th of May, 1845, appalling calamity, the fall of Yarmouth Suspension Bridge. One of the most calamitous events which ever befell this town or any other in this district of the kingdom has just transpired, and has spread lamentation and grief throughout the entire population. The scene of this dreadful event was that the suspension bridge on the North Quay crossing the River Bure, and which had been entrance to the town from the railway terminus and the new road from Arkle. Cook's Equestrian Company has some time been staying in the town, and on the morning of this fateful day, Friday last, it was announced by public handbills that Nelson, one of the clowns, would sail up the River Bure, starting from Yarmouth Bridge to Vauxhall Gardens at 5 o'clock in a common wash tub drawn by 4 real geese, elegantly harnessed and dressed. At the time appointed, this absurd exhibition took place. The clown and his geese started from the old bridge in the presence of an immense concourse of persons who had assembled on the banks of the river to witness the feat. By far the most advantageous view was had from the suspension bridge, and this was eagerly sought for by the unsuspecting populace. About 400 people occupied this position and were pressing on the south side to obtain the first glance of the coming wonder. The bridge is an elegant structure suspended from 2 piers and capable of standing a much larger number of persons than we have named, but we understand every point of vision toward the spot where the geese were supposed to be looked for was densely crammed with men, women and children, and even the chains and suspenders had many occupants. This, the bridge which has been the cause of so much litigation between the Yarmouth Railway Company and Mr. Corey, its proprietor, and which has since the arrangement with the parties become the principal, if not the only, medium of transit to and from the railway terminus. In order to accommodate this increased traffic, the proprietors have been induced to extend the bridge on each side by the chains to the extent of 4 feet for foot passengers. The platform on the south side was the chief receptacle for the multitude who were on the bridge on this occasion, and the north side was comparatively empty. Consequently, there was an extreme pressure on the south, so much so that a gentleman who passed over noticed that the crown of the bridge, instead of maintaining its convex form, was completely flattened. He remarked the circumstance to a companion, but at this moment all eyes were stretched to the utmost, and every ear listening with eagerness for the first announcement of the clown's appearance. This anxiety was brought to the highest pitch of the cry, "Here come the geese!" The shout resounded from side to side, but amidst was a shriek from the shores. The bridge was observed to give way. Lowered on one side, the chains snapped asunder, one after the other in momentary succession, and almost before the gaze of the thronged multitude could be drawn from its object of worthless interest, it was riveted to the half-sunken bridge, suspended one side by its unbroken chains, cleared of all its occupants, every one of whom was plunged into the stream, and over them the waters were flowing, as if unconscious of the fearful tragedy which had momentarily occurred. Those who witnessed it asserted that not a scream was heard, nor a sound emitted from the unfortunate victims. A fearful splash and a few gurgling struggles only recognized the spot which had swallowed such a mass of human life. Some few men hanging by the broken chains were earnestly entreated to maintain their hold, but it was soon observed that in consequence of the obstruction of the stream by the fallen bridge and the human bodies below, that the advancing tide would soon bury even them from sight. Every boat was immediately in requisition, and as many as 25 were soon on the spot and rendered active and gallant service. The scene at this moment beggars description. Husbands and wives, parents and children were excited with the deepest anxiety. The efforts to save the victims were noble and praiseworthy. One man who was precipitated from the bridge caught a hold and maintained it. A woman made a desperate clutch at his ankles and succeeded in reaching them. The brave fellow looked down, and though in fearful peril himself, encouraged her to hold tight, and she was rescued. The man refused to get into the boat, telling the occupants to pick up those who were floating about the river. Subsequently, however, he was obliged to release his hold, and he fell into the stream. We are happy to say that a rope was thrown to him immediately, and he was brought safely ashore. The bodies were picked up in quick succession, most of them dead. Among the number was a woman, doubtless a mother, who had in her arms an infant, and in one hand a little girl, 3 or 4 years old. She had firmly grasped both, and her firm hold had not been broken by the struggles of death, for it was with difficulty they were separated. They were all corpses and very stiff. Their names we have not been able to learn. The various incidents of the tragic scene are some of them very touching. The children were many of them found with their heads fast in the railing, which, on the bursting of the chains, lapped over into the water, doubtless fixing in that position in their anxiety to feast their eyes on the expectant sight. It was with difficulty they were extricated, and there were some discovered with their heads smashed to pieces by the falling of the ironwork. No less than 53 corpses were brought into one house, the Norwich Arms Inn, which defied all the means of restoration. We lament also to say that of the number who had been taken out of the river at 11 o'clock at night, the eyes of 73 were forever closed in death. The great majority of them were women and children. Persons whose relatives and whose children were down to see the sight, on hearing of the catastrophe, flocked from all parts of the town to make inquiries and to examine the dead bodies. Fathers and mothers were moaning for their children, and children for their parents, husbands for their wives, and the awful, distressing scene was such that no description can do justice to. The bodies were removed by the relations as they were recognised, and at 12 o'clock only one body remained in the Norwich Arms stables that had not been recognised. With the exception of this, which is supposed to be a waterman named Eccleston, all the rest have been removed. Several bodies are said to have passed under the bridge, and it seems to be impossible to remove them without great violence, or, as our informant says, pulling them limb from limb. Nets have been laid down across the river by Mr. Richard Hammond and Mr. Davy, and were to be taken up on the flow of the tide at 2 o'clock, when it is expected that many other bodies will be brought up, for it is thought that there are still many other persons drowned whose bodies are not yet recovered, and inquiries are perpetually being made by parents and relations who have missed members of their family, the fate of whom unquestioned. Further particulars. Saturday. Early on Saturday, a number of men were set to work to raise the bridge. Cranes were set and chains drawn under it, but they had not succeeded in raising it by 3 o'clock. Bodies continued to be found during the day, and there must be several yet under the bridge. Many children were sitting on the bridge with their legs through the rails at the time the accident, and no doubt are fixed underneath it. Sunday. 113 bodies have been already taken out of the river. The number will probably be 130 to 140, as many are under the bridge, as well as those who have been carried up the river. The bridge has fallen down on the side nearest Braden, and forms a complete barrier to the stream and navigation. The excitement and sympathy occasioned by this dreadful disaster continues unabated. The trains are overflowing. Although many tales emerged in the wake of the tragedy, of gallant rescues, miraculous survivals, and ordinary townsfolk transformed into heroes. Not every story from that day offered comfort. As the days passed, other accounts surfaced. Some were whispered in public houses, others written in trembling hands, all of them more troubling in tone. Among the most disturbing was a letter published in the Meath Herald and Cavan Advertiser, said to be written by a young man from near Bury. His account, if true, was not one of nobility, but of raw survival. It offers a glimpse in the chaos beneath the waterline, where the fight for life blurred the boundary between instinct and violence, and where, in his own words, the face of a drowning woman would haunt him for the rest of his days. The Meath Herald and Cavan Advertiser, the 17th of May, 1845, Yarmouth Suspension Bridge. Some sensation has been caused at Yarmouth by the production of a letter reported to be written by a young man residing in the neighbourhood of Bury, who alleges that he was amongst the persons on the bridge and whose tale, in harrowing detail, exceeds all that perhaps was ever placed before the public. He says, the chain on the Yarmouth side broke and let it down only on that side. Remember, while the other side still hung all right. You will have to have an exact resemblance by letting the leaf of a table down. Not a timber or bar of the bridge broke, but it shot us all into the water. There we were. The screams were horrible. They were heard for miles. To supernatural presence of mind and a strong arm, I owe my escape. I felt an iron under me, and I clung to it in a death grasp. My mouth being full of salty water, for the tide was up. I raised myself on the bridge and got my head above the water. I clung up to the iron and looked about me. Scarcely had I done so, I was not out of the water further than my chin. Then a man grasped me round the neck. His head was just above the water. I felt myself going. I drew my arm and struck him on the face. I hit him hard, for the skin is off my knuckles. A woman next seized me. I was forced to strike her, and her blood spurted from her nose all over my face and dimmed my eyes. I was the only one above the water, but the bridge gave another move, and I was under. I rose again, but folks were under the water clinging to me. The case was now desperate. I felt in my pocket, and holding by one hand, I opened my knife with the other. I cut all down my legs, but could not make them leave go. My knife and hands were covered with blood. A woman seized my waistcoat. She was young and really handsome, a tradesman's daughter. I did not like to strike her, but necessity was imperative. I hit her. She rolled over and was drowned. Never shall I forget her look at me. It seemed to say, "You murdered me." I once more used my knife about a man and jumped to a boat and was pulled in, with two girls clinging to me, and got safe to shore. The presence of mind that supported me during this trial instantly deserted me, and I was carried to the next public house. I drank some brandy and walked home with my hands and face covered with blood. I went to bed and dreamt of it. I thought of the woman whom I struck and came and reproached me for murdering her. In the stunned aftermath, grief quickly turned to fury. Nearly 100 lives had been lost, most of them children, and the town wanted answers. Who was to blame? The bridge owners? The railway? The police who failed to control the crowd? Or was it the bridge itself, already rumoured to have been altered, weakened, or neglected? Under Victorian law, no sudden mass death could pass without full public accounting, and so began the grim legal necessity an inquest not on a disaster but on 97 individual human beings. Each body had to be examined, each name recorded, each death accounted for. It was a process both painstaking and agonizing, conducted in rooms still echoing with the wails of the bereaved. People demanded truth and justice. What they got instead was something far more unsettling. From the Globe, the 8th of May, 1845, the late awful catastrophe at Yarmouth. On Wednesday, Mr. Ferrier, the coroner, and jury again assembled at the Guildhall in Yarmouth to renew the painful inquiry concerning the fate of the poor creatures who suffered the late falling of the suspension bridge. In addition to the 65 bodies which were identified in the course of Monday, the names of whom have already been given, there are 9 others who have been recognised. There's supposed to be at least full 13 bodies still under the water, making the aggregate loss of life at about 90. The day's proceedings consisted chiefly of receiving evidence as to the identification of the several bodies, and the inquiry was adjourned until tomorrow, Thursday, when the whole facts relating to a shocking occurrence will be gone into in order to give the jury every facility of ascertaining the character and solidity of the work which led to this sad affair. The coroner has directed 2 or 3 eminent engineers to minutely examine the construction of the falling bridge, when they will be called upon to give their opinion respecting it. As had been before stated, the accident happened by breaking of one of the main chains by which the bridge was suspended, and on inspecting that particular part, it will be observed that the iron had oxidized and had become so eaten away with rust that a centre only remained about 1.5 inches in diameter. This important fact, it is to be hoped, will not be lost sight of by the proper authorities during the investigation. In the months that followed, debate reached Parliament. There was no criminal conviction, but the tragedy sparked national concern over public safety, bridge design and crowd control. A new, more conventional bridge on piles was quickly thrown up near the site of the collapsed suspension bridge, the shattered platform of the old bridge repurposed for the new road. No single piece of legislation was passed directly as a result, but across the country, local authorities began to reassess the risks of crowd gatherings and temporary structures. The official death toll varies by report. Some newspapers claimed as many as 97 lives lost. Others settled at 79, with 77 bodies recovered. Nearly all were children or adolescents. In a grim detail offered by the Westmoreland Gazette, it was noted that not one of that number had any person dependent on him or her. Whether this was meant to reassure or justify, it only sharpened the sense of needless loss. No one was ever held criminally responsible. The coroner's inquest found that the bridge chains had oxidized to the point of near disintegration, and yet had passed muster. Despite national outrage and questions raised in Parliament, no new safety law was passed. The bridge was never repaired. Instead, a simple pile bridge was thrown across the Bure, reusing parts of the broken structure, a daily reminder of how fragile a spectacle can become. On that day, the geese arrived, but the crowd that had gathered to greet them, that never would. Further particulars. In today's further particulars, something a little different. Given the scale of tragedy we've just covered, we'll step aside from our usual odd murders and alarming scoundrels and instead bring you a Victorian News Digest, a kind of 1845 scroll, if you will. The following selection appeared under the headings Gleanings in the Westmoreland Gazette on the 21st of June 1845, a hodgepodge of curious news items from near and far. And with no shame whatsoever, we'll admit, we find an 1845 news feed far more interesting than most of the things that show up in our news feeds of today. We hope you feel the same. From the Westmoreland Gazette, the 21st of June 1845, Gleanings. On Saturday evening last, a fine cock pheasant entered the Manchester Union workhouse through a bedroom window which was open. The strange visitor was immediately captured and, not having previously obtained a certificate from the overseers, was returned to Cheetham at the township which it belonged. According to the last census of the population of Russia, the serfs amounted to 42 million people, 16 million of whom belong to the Crown, and 27 million to private individuals. The entire population of the empire exceeded 53 million souls, serfs thereby comprising 79% of the total population. A few days ago, Mr. George Fish, son of a respectable builder at Nottingham, was accidentally shot through the head with the ramrod of his own fowling piece. The rod passed through the lip, the jawbone, the base of the skull, the brain, and out at the back of the skull, and could only be driven back with strong blows from a mallet. It was pulled out at his mouth with a pair of forceps. The sufferer died, however, the following day. The ship Diana, of 400 tons burden, bound from Liverpool to St. Petersburg with bales of cotton and silk, was destroyed by spontaneous combustion amongst the cotton bales on the 23rd inst, not far from Ellisnore. Strange as it may appear, the more water was thrown upon the cargo, the stronger the flames seemed to rage. The destruction of the ship was total, but the crew escaped. A reward of 6pence each for every dog captured was last week offered by the Stockport Police Committee. The next day the police station was literally besieged by idle lads and men with canine prisoners. The wretched girl, Martha Bexley, who was tried for the murder of the infant son of John Finch, Esquire, solicitor of Greenwich, was removed on the 4th inst to Bethlehem Hospital, where she will be kept for the rest of her days. Myriads of locusts are devastating the province of Toledo. The authorities allow so much per pound for the capture of these destructive insects. In the district of Maranello, towards of 300 arrobas, which is 7,500 pounds, locusts are daily collected. A farm servant from the Malvern Wells died last week from drinking cider which had been conveyed from the cider house in leadened pipes. He and several other farm servants were seized with illness resembling the painter's colic, and the rest in the case of the deceased was congestion of the brain, of which he died. The pipes had been ordered to be proper white metal, but the tradesmen employed had substituted lead. An antidote to arsenic has been discovered by Dr. Bunsen in the hydrated peroxide of iron, a simple preparation and one which ought to have a place on the shelves of every druggist in the kingdom. The usual post office returns just issued show results which must highly be gratifying to the friends of the penny postage. The total number of letters delivered in the United Kingdom in the year 1844 was 242 million, which is an increase of nearly 22 million from the previous year. The number before the reduction of the rate, it may be necessary to remind our readers, was 75 million. From the Globe on the 5th of May 1845, Hungerford Bridge. Yesterday, at an early hour, people were seen flocking from all quarters towards the new bridge, and the turnstiles on each side were in perpetual motion. Before the hours of 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, upwards of 30,000 persons passed over the bridge, and in the evening it was crowded to excess. It was thought that the appalling catastrophe at Yarmouth would prevent a great influx of visitors, but such was not the case. The sad details of the fearful loss of life at Yarmouth excited the curiosity of Londoners, who exhibited much anxiety to ascertain the principle of a suspension bridge. This concludes our journey into the tragic events of Yarmouth in 1845, a day that began in laughter and ended in lasting sorrow. If you'd like to be notified when future episodes are released, please do consider subscribing, tapping the bell, and giving the episode a like. It helps other discoveries of these stories of history, and we'd be most grateful for your company on the next. If you'd like to support the channel and access our full archives of episodes, including exclusive content and early ad-free releases, you can find us over on Patreon. Every supporter helps keep these stories alive, and we're truly grateful for your kind company there. You can find the link in the description below. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, historian, enthusiast, and collector of the curious. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the darkest days in Yarmouth history. Until next time, stay curious.